The air inside the Voss Enterprises boardroom hung heavy, thick with the kind of anticipation that precedes a storm. Executives sat straighter, exchanging furtive glances and hushed whispers. This was a high-stakes meeting, one that could shape the company's future: numbers, profits, losses, and deals sealed in shadowed corners. But no one could have anticipated what happened when Isabella Voss walked in. Her sharp heels struck the marble floor like the ticking of a countdown, each step radiating a cold, unyielding confidence that made even the most arrogant men in the room shrink. Isabella, a wealthy widow and the company's chairwoman, commanded attention effortlessly. Yet it wasn't her presence that stunned the room, it was the man at her side. Reid wore no tailored suit, carried no leather briefcase, and adjusted no luxury watch. Instead, he stood in a dark blue janitor's jumpsuit, clutching a dirty rag he'd likely forgotten to set down before being dragged into this world. Silence crashed over the room. Executives traded baffled looks, their chairs creaking as they shifted, as if questioning their own eyes. Lawrence Whitman, the CFO, cleared his throat, forcing a strained smile. "Mrs. Voss, Isabella raised a hand, silencing him before he could stumble further. "I invited him." Lucas kept his head down, shoulders rigid, avoiding every gaze. He looked like a fish flung onto dry land, utterly out of place in this realm of expensive suits and million-dollar decisions. But Isabella wasn't about to let him fade into the background. She took her seat at the head of the long glass table, tilting her head slightly as if savoring the unease rippling through the room. After a pause that stretched like an eternity, she spoke, her voice calm but edged with steel. "I know what you're all thinking. And I don't care." No one could have predicted what came next. Lucas felt the weight of a dozen stares pressing down on him. He was used to being invisible, a shadow sweeping hallways, ignored by the very people he cleaned up after. But today, he was the center of attention, an intruder in a world that wasn't his. He gripped the rag tighter, longing to vanish. Isabella, however, had other plans. She leaned forward, lacing her fingers on the table. "I'm sure you're wondering why I asked Lucas to join us today," she said, her gaze sweeping the room. "Let me tell you a story." Weeks earlier, Isabella had been passing the staff break room on the 6th floor, a place she rarely visited, on her way to a meeting when something unusual caught her ear. It wasn't idle chatter or complaints about work, it was a conversation about investment strategies. She paused, initially assuming one of her financial advisors had wandered into the wrong space. But the voice was unfamiliar, steady, thoughtful, steeped in the kind of wisdom born from experience, not textbooks. "Don't touch that stock right now," the voice said. "It's a short-term gain, but look at the market trends. The real money's in undervalued assets. Take the 2008 crash. Everyone thought they could ride the wave, but the smart ones knew where to invest when the dust settled." Isabella raised an eyebrow. She peered through the doorway and saw Lucas, seated at the lunch table with another janitor, breaking down complex financial concepts with startling clarity. She lingered for 15 minutes, captivated. He spoke of market cycles, companies poised for growth, and risks most overlooked. His words weren't dressed in Wall Street jargon. They were raw, practical, like those of someone who truly understood money, not just numbers on a screen. It didn't add up. Why was a janitor talking like a hedge fund manager? Isabella strode in, cutting their conversation short. Lucas fell silent, his face paling as if caught sneaking into forbidden territory. "I need to ask you something," she said evenly. "Where did you learn all that?" Lucas hesitated, his fingers tapping nervously on the table. After a long pause, he sighed. "My dad owned a small business. He taught me everything he knew about finance. When he died, I had to drop out of college. Couldn't afford it." Isabella studied him for a moment. In that instant, she made her decision. "I want you at a meeting with me next week. Just sit, listen, and if I ask you something, answer honestly." Lucas froze. "A meeting? With your executives?" She nodded. I don't think, you don't need to think," she interrupted. "Just show up." He wanted to refuse, but her gaze told him this wasn't a request. And so, Here he was, standing in a room full of people waiting for him to fail. But what happened next, not even Isabella could have foreseen. The silence in the boardroom was suffocating, thick enough to slice. The only sound was the faint ticking of an antique clock on the far wall. Lucas's pulse thundered in his ears, every instinct screaming at him to flee. This wasn't his world, a place for Ivy League graduates with expensive watches, not a janitor who scrubbed floors by night. Martin Caldwell, an executive, leaned back in his chair, adjusting his tie with a smirk dripping with condescension. "Mrs. Voss," he said, his tone barely polite, "I'm sure we all appreciate the gesture, but I assume there's a point?" Isabella's smile was sharp, not warm, but the kind that signaled she was playing chess while others fumbled with checkers. "There is," she said. "Lucas is here because I want him to weigh in on today's discussion." A wave of disbelief rippled through the room. Lawrence Whitman shifted uncomfortably, choosing his words with care. "With all due respect, today's agenda involves critical financial decisions." I don't see how he could offer relevant insight. Isabella's smile didn't falter. "Funny," she replied, "because last week, when I overheard Lucas explaining long-term investment strategies, he made more sense than half of you do in these meetings." Awkward glances darted around. Martin let out a scoffing laugh. "Fine," he said, turning to Lucas. "By all means, impress us." The room fell dead silent again. Lucas felt every eye on him, waiting for him to stumble. His throat was dry, his palms slick with sweat. What was he supposed to say? For a fleeting second, he considered bolting. But then he thought of his father, the late nights at the dining table, poring over numbers, studying market reports from second-hand business journals. He remembered what he'd lost when his dad passed, how all that knowledge had lain dormant while he mopped floors and emptied trash bins. And suddenly, something ignited within him. Lucas took a deep breath and met Martin's gaze. "You're worried about the underperforming assets, right?" Martin raised an eyebrow. "Obviously." Lucas nodded, not out of nerves, but because he already knew the answer to a problem no one in this room had cracked. "I read the reports," he said, his voice steadying. "The issue isn't the assets, it's how you're evaluating them." A murmur swept through the room. Martin sneered. "And how do you suggest we evaluate them?" Lucas leaned forward, no longer trembling. "The way a smart investor looks at a company during a recession," he said. "Not by its current value, but by its potential." The murmuring stopped. Isabella smiled. This was exactly what she'd been waiting for. But the real shock came when Lucas began dissecting numbers even the top executives had missed. Minutes ago, Lucas had been a janitor, an outsider who didn't belong. Now he held their attention, the kind that only comes when people realize they've gravely underestimated someone. Martin crossed his arms, his smirk gone. "All right," he said slowly. "Let's say we're evaluating potential instead of current value. What are we missing?" Lucas exhaled. He'd spent years watching executives make decisions from afar, but now he was in the ring. He looked straight at Lawrence. "The logistics division," he said. "That's your real problem." Lawrence blinked, caught off guard. "How did you?" "I read the reports," Lucas cut in. "You're bleeding money because you're outsourcing distribution instead of optimizing internally." Silence settled over the table. Lucas pressed on. "Your outsourcing costs have spiked 12% in the last 2 quarters, but your internal fleet's running at under 50% capacity. You're paying premium rates for services you've already got the infrastructure to handle yourselves." Lawrence squirmed in his seat. "We ran models that suggested." "Your models used outdated fuel cost projections and pre-pandemic freight rates," Lucas interrupted. "They don't hold up anymore." The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop. Alyssa Chin, a junior executive, scrolled furiously on her tablet. "Wait," she muttered. "He's right." Lucas continued. "You're sitting on millions in underutilized assets. Instead of cutting jobs, restructure the distribution model. Use the fleet, cut outsourcing by 30%. That alone saves you at least $8 million a year." Another executive spoke up. "If that's true, why didn't we see it?" Lucas turned to him. "Because you weren't looking." The murmurs grew. Isabella finally spoke, her voice carrying the weight of authority. That's why Lucas is here. Lawrence let out a slow breath and leaned forward. Can you show us how to implement it? Lucas hesitated. This was the moment: back down or step up. He clenched his fists under the table, then, with a voice steadier than he'd expected, said, yes. But what Isabella said next left everyone reeling. I want you to take the role of financial consultant, she declared, her tone as calm as if it were a foregone conclusion. Effective immediately. The room erupted. Martin's chair scraped loudly as he shot to his feet. Isabella, are you serious? A janitor as a consultant? Yes, she replied, unflinching. Lawrence pinched the bridge of his nose. This isn't how we hire people. It is today, Isabella snapped. Martin laughed, incredulous. You can't just. I own this company, Martin, she said, tilting her head. I can do whatever I want. Lucas sat stunned, his mind racing to catch up. Isabella turned to him. I don't care that you don't have a degree, Lucas. I care about results. You saw what no one else in this room did. You solved a problem that's been eating our profits for over a year. I don't let talent go to waste. I don't know what to say, he stammered. Say, yes, she replied. And he did, uttering the single word that would change his life forever. But what came next was even more unexpected. As the meeting ended, Isabella kept Lucas behind. They stepped into her private elevator, ascending to the top floor, her personal office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city's skyline. She turned to him, her gaze piercing. You think this was luck? Lucas frowned. Wasn't it? She let out a quiet laugh. No, Lucas. I did my homework. Before I stepped into that break room, before I brought you here, I already knew everything about you. His stomach tightened. What? I know your father owned a small business. I know you dropped out of college when he died. I know you've been reading financial reports in the janitor's closet for the past 3 years. I know you check stock trends on your phone before clocking in. Everyone in this company overlooked you, until today. Lucas froze, his heart pounding. This wasn't random. She'd been watching him. The next day, when he walked into Voss Enterprises as a financial consultant, not a janitor, the stares hit him hard, skeptical, surprised, even hostile. But as he stood at the boardroom table, spreading out reports and speaking with unshakable confidence, he was no longer the invisible man who swept floors. He belonged. And when Martin Caldwell made one last attempt to challenge him, Lucas smiled, a cold, steady smile. If you don't believe me, keep doing things your way. But don't be surprised when your competitors overtake you, because I know they're listening to what I said today. The room fell silent. Isabella nodded, satisfied. But Lucas's real test was only just beginning.